Thank you, Allison. Good morning, everyone. If it's morning where you are, I understand now. I remember when Homeboy was a little storefront operation, visiting Father Greg many years ago in Boyle Heights. And Homeboy is now gone with a global network. So it's beautiful, beautiful to see, and really appreciate being invited here by the Homeboy family to share some thoughts and reflections with you. I'm dialing in from videoing in from our office in downtown or near downtown Los Angeles, which is only 2 blocks away from Homeboy Industries, and where I frequently, certainly pre-COVID, had breakfast and lunch and coffee visiting Homeboy right down the street. So thank you so much for having me. I want to provide some shout outs and acknowledgements. First of all, to the Homeboy Board of Directors, a great group of leaders who support Father Greg and the vision of Homeboy Industries, all of the staff at Homeboy, whether you work in the cafe or where the t-shirts and books are sold, or doing work supporting peacemaking and peacekeeping in the community, or working at the restaurant. Just thank you for all of the staff, and then all of the partners and stakeholders and shareholders of Homeboy Industry and its philosophy and spirit and ethos. And then, of course, Father Greg, who continues to be a friend, a mentor, a colleague, an inspiration for me as a foundation CEO here at the California Endowment. Our mission is to improve the health and wellness of all Californians, particularly those most vulnerable. And we've been partner investors with Homeboy Industries for more than 2 decades, and continue to invest, and are thrilled with and proud of the accomplishments that they've made. And there's so much to celebrate. It was the theme of no going back, given where we are with the pandemic and what has happened as a result of COVID in particular, but more broadly around the lack of social justice and true racial equality and inclusivity in our nation, that I was asked to share a few thoughts with you. The dastardly COVID-19 pandemic, which we thought was fading in the rearview mirror, at this moment is now back in the form of the Delta variant. This meeting that we're having right now, we should have been in person. We typically host it at our own conference center here in Los Angeles at the California Endowment. I'm not able to do that this year. I'm hoping, as many of you are, that when we get back to normal, and I hope we do get back to being normalized post-COVID, that we have an opportunity to meet in person, and that we'll more cherish and appreciate what meeting in person means, and not meeting by video. It's just not the same. And the stubborn and dastardly COVID-19 pandemic has really interfered with our ability to meet in person and understand the value of real eyeball-to-eyeball contact, of a hand on a shoulder, of a hug and embrace, a meaningful and authentic handshake, holding hands in circle, in prayer, supporting one another. Certainly I miss that. I know our communities miss that, and hopefully we'll cherish it more when we get back to meeting in person. But back to the theme of no going back. And so COVID-19, and it is my hope that our nation takes a lesson from COVID-19, and that lesson really should honor the more than 500,000 human beings in the United States alone that have perished as a result of COVID-19. It is my hope that those lives were not lost in vain, that we learn a lesson from the loss of those lives and all the tragedy that has befallen families impacted by this terrible pandemic, and that we resolve to never going back to the conditions which have allowed for social justice and racial justice and inequality to be unmasked and exacerbated by the COVID-19 epidemic. And the question of how do we never go back to the conditions that we've come from in terms of inequality, particularly racial and social justice inequality in this country. But the more important question is, where are we going to? We want to never go back to the conditions that have led to the devastation of COVID-19, but where are we headed? And I wanted to share some thoughts with you that have been, quite frankly, shaped and informed by our work with Homeboy Industries and others who have had a vision of a better and more beautiful future, a beloved community future that Martin Luther King spoke about many years ago and reinforced by a civil rights icon, John Lewis. How do we have and create a beloved community in Los Angeles, in California, in the nation, and across the globe? So COVID-19 told us, you know what, we've got a lot of structural inequality in this nation, not just in health and in public health, but in prisons, in housing, in immigrant communities, in the elderly and in the poor. And COVID-19 unmasked so much of this inequality. So no going back is not necessarily about a virus, but it's about the systems and structures of inequality that must now and forevermore change. And our nation in 2026, our nation will be celebrating or acknowledging the 250th anniversary of the nation's birth with the Declaration of Independence. And so that gives us a good 5-year window between now and 2026 to revisit the social contract, the understanding between the governed and the government about what racial justice and true inclusion means in this country. And so I think COVID-19 as a grim but timely reminder of the work that we must do in this nation. But it all hinges on matters of something very familiar to the Homeboy family, matters of hope and voice and civic participation and changing systems and policies and structures that are at the root cause of so much inequality in health, in the economy, in housing, in wellness. And I want to use an example to lift this up because that can sound pretty lofty and pretty academic. So I'm going to use the example of driving a car, which most of us and nearly all of us are familiar with. And bear with me while I tease out where I'm going with this particular example. In the 1970s, car crashes and car fatalities were substantially higher than they are in this country right now. At its worst, we were losing more than 55,000 Americans a year to car crashes. And since then, we have cut that by more than half. We are now at about 30,000 or so deaths a year. The rate is actually even lower. But we've done a good and commendable job of saving nearly 30,000 lives a year on the highways and streets as a result of reductions in car crash fatalities and car crash mortality rate. And the question is, how did that happen? Why did it happen? And the punchline here is that people fought for key policy and system and structural changes, and through civic action and civic participation, forced politicians and elected officials in Congress, in state governments, in local governments to make important changes that have saved lives. So we now have, which we didn't have many years ago, seatbelts required in the construction of cars. We now have seatbelt laws to assure that people actually wear those seatbelts when they're driving. We have federal and state laws mandating seatbelt use. Cars are now designed and built with safety features that they didn't have before, such as airbags. We didn't always have airbags. For those of you that are under the age of 35, there was a time when we didn't have airbags, and airbags were developed to improve driver safety. We have driving under the influence and drinking and driving laws that are significant and substantial, not just in the US, but around the globe, particularly in developed nations. And education has happened around drinking and driving. And much of the impetus for this came from advocates who were fighting the fight for consumer safety and driver safety. And on the driving under the influence and drinking and driving side of things, the leadership for those DUI laws and policies and changes really was not led by public health. Public health came in support, but it was a group called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Parents who were directly impacted by the experiences of tragedy and loss of a loved one, imploring Congress and imploring governors and imploring state officials to change drinking and driving laws and policies and to enhance education for drivers around the dangers of drinking and driving. And so fatalities are down substantially since the 1970s. We call them fatalities. In public health, we use the term car crashes, although the more publicly used term is car accidents. There's a very subtle and important difference there. In public health, the business that I'm trained in, I'm a pediatrician by training, and I practice on public health. I led public health departments in Philadelphia and in San Diego prior to coming to San Diego, prior to coming to the California Endowment. But we don't use the term accidents in public health because we believe that much of the pain and suffering, particularly as it related to this issue of car crashes, was predictable and therefore preventable. And so we don't use the term, you won't hear a public health person use the term car accidents, we'll use the term car crashes because we don't believe in the random act of an accident. We believe in prevention and education and the predictability of data. So that's how I want you to think about never going back as a framework. And what I'm saying to you is that much of the devastation we saw exacerbated or caused by COVID-19 is preventable and predictable and structural in its orientation. Right? And we don't believe that the devastation caused by COVID-19, with someone dying or getting ill or falling into economic catastrophe as a result, is bad luck. I know for many of us in the work that we do, particularly if you're doing anything around the work of community violence, and you'll hear if there's a shooting or a drive-by shooting or a violent act, maybe at a community party, and you'll hear our folks use the expression to explain what happened. Well, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or, well, it was just his time, Well, I am someone who is both a science-trained public health practitioner and professional, but I also go to church every Sunday. I believe in a heavenly creator. The first thing I do when I wake up every morning is open up my phone and turn to my Bible app and read the verse of the day. So I am someone who is anchored in spirituality and faith. And I believe in a creator that is bigger than all of us. And we can have a debate about whether that creator takes the time to pick and choose who should die when. Not interested in having a debate or arguing about that, whether that's true or not. What I do want to impress upon you and us and all of us is that inequality and structural inequality, unemployment, homelessness, hopelessness, crime, violence, shootings, these are man-made, system-generated phenomena. They are predictable, and they are predictable as a result of structures of inequality. And if they are structures of inequality that have been man-made, they can be unmade by men and women who provide leadership. And I define leadership as hope in action, that 3-word, hope in action, by changing policies and systems, as has happened with car crashes and fatalities. So as a society, we don't have a homelessness problem. We have created and manufactured a homelessness problem. It is predictable that people would be living on the streets, given the structures and policies around unemployment, around lack of affordable housing, around lack of substance abuse treatment, around lack of mental health services and adequate community-based supports. We can predict and know that we will manufacture hopelessness and homelessness and incarceration unless we change the very systems and structures that lead to producing it in the first place. And so when we resolve to never going back, that's what we need to resolve to never going back to, is a time when we blame the victims of poverty and of socialized trauma and of racialized trauma for their plight, and address the underlying root causes, the structural root causes that lead to people being incarcerated, to people being out on the street, to people being homeless, to people feeling like they have to resort to violence to address an issue. And so what never going back lessons has COVID-19 taught us? It's about the importance of what civil rights icon John Lewis called the work of good troublemakers. Good troublemakers, advocates, grassroots leaders who challenge the traditional beliefs and rituals, who say we can do better and we must do better, and employ the systems and elected officials and Congress and governors that we can do better. And that's been our orientation at the California Endowment. We invest in the work of good troublemakers, like Homeboy Industries, who have a reimagined view of public safety, that public safety is not determined by SWAT teams and Glocks and police presence, but by a real sense of compassion and inclusion and community and love. And that you can reimagine public safety and community safety through that lens. And that's what we must resolve never to go back to, is assuming that in the case of community safety and policing, the way we've had public safety and community safety envisioned over the last 50 years is the way that we must do it in the next 50 years. It must change. And so we've been investing in the good troublemakers, even with greater frequency in the last several years, because we've seen the results of when you invest in someone's sense of hope and their energy and their passion and their drive to change systems, good things happen. You have to be patient. It doesn't happen overnight, but good things happen. And at the California Endowment, we've just finished a 10-year campaign called Building Healthy Communities. We invested $1.5 billion in 14 communities up and down the state, including Boyle Heights, investing in the ideas, the energy of those good troublemakers to change systems, to change policies, to change structures, to never going back to the old way of manufacturing hopelessness. And the short answer, the short theory of how we describe our investment thesis is ABC, or A plus B equals C, where A stands for agency, B stands for a spirit of belonging or inclusion, and C stands for change. And we have found over the last 10 years, through our evaluation and research, that we invest in people's agency, their own individual or collective power to insist on change. When we invest in a spirit of full inclusion, a spirit of belonging, a spirit of community, the beloved community that Martin Luther King referred to. When you have agency in the spirit of inclusion and belonging, you get systems change. I'm going to give you 3 concrete examples about how this theory has worked based on our recent work, and all of you will be familiar with some of these victories. Let me start with the first example. About 12 years ago, just before we started our Building Healthy Communities campaign, I was invited to a grassroots storefront organization in South Los Angeles, much like Homeboy Industries in its early days, led by grassroots, particularly young grassroots, Black and brown young people, many of them impacted by the juvenile justice system, many of them formerly incarcerated themselves, called the Youth Justice Coalition. They had a center that was a hard scrabble facility, fraying carpet, old computer equipment, walls needed paint, but there was a sense of energy and vibrancy and dynamism inside that facility as those young people committed to serving those incarcerated or formerly incarcerated young people who were trying to get out of the system and reintegrate into their communities. And they shared with me a vision for justice reform that I actually had not heard up until that point. Now, up until that point, we viewed at the California Endowment, we were making grants to support better mental health services inside juvenile justice facilities and juvenile halls and in prisons. But the vision of these impacted young people was a different vision. Their vision was no more juvenile halls. That in this nation, there is no need to incarcerate young people, and that we should be closing, decarcerating juvenile halls and juvenile detention facilities, and we should be creating community-based systems of care to support them. And so that was a vision that I really had not heard or appreciated. And my first reaction was, well, that sounds pretty lofty. I mean, you know, some kids need prison, don't they? But the young people from the Youth Justice Coalition insisted that this was the right way to go. We began to invest in their work and in their vision, and them working in partnership with many others over the last decade have begun to influence and shape how both Sacramento and the LA County Board of Supervisors think about juvenile detention and juvenile incarceration. And their work has begun to inform. We're beginning to see not only the reduction in population of juvenile offenders detained in prisons or detained in detention centers, but we're beginning to see juvenile detention facilities close. And the County Board of Supervisors and the state looking at investing in more community-based alternatives to incarceration. That's what I mean by transformational systems change. That's an example of never going back. It's just not playing around at the margins of the existing system. It's turning the system on its head and asking a very profound strategic and moral question. Why is it in this nation that we incarcerate young people at all? And can we rethink the system with that in mind? Second example was right after the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, passed in Obama's, I guess it was early in his second term as president. And when Obamacare passed, it greatly improved and enhanced the number of uninsured Americans who had access to health insurance coverage. But for political reasons, much of the immigrant community, and in particular undocumented people, were left out of Obamacare. And we were funding organizations who supported Dreamers, those young people, those undocumented young people themselves who were directly impacted by policies adversely impacting the undocumented. And they began to insist and demand that when Obamacare would be implemented in the state of California should open up the Medi-Cal program and open up health coverage to the undocumented, and that the undocumented should not be left behind. Sounded like a long shot at the time we heard this idea and this proposal. So where's the money going to come from? But those young people organized, they mobilized. Over the course of about an 18-month campaign, they got their voices heard. And we were supporting their work through what we called a Health for All campaign. And I remember on a Friday morning, I received a lovely phone call from the health committee chair at the time, Senator Ricardo Lara, who's a terrific leader, and said, "Hey, Bob, I just want to let you know that we love the campaign work you've been investing in. Those dreamers have been amazing. We've been convinced that the state of California should open up the Medi-Cal program and begin opening it up to young people that are undocumented. And I'm going to put a bill forward called the Health for All bill after the campaign and see if we can convince the legislature and the governor to begin opening up the Medi-Cal program to undocumented young people." I could not have been more thrilled in hearing that news. That bill went on to succeed. The governor signed it. That was several years ago. In this budget, there was an additional opening up of the Medi-Cal program for the undocumented. And so the job is not done, it's not complete. But we're beginning to see the state of California investing in structural and systemic and policy changes that advance a spirit of belonging, a spirit of inclusion, a spirit of wellness in a political environment that was not easy. And so, again, from people that were directly impacted by the experiences of our immigration policy, young people drove that never going back systems change and system of care. And then third example is in school suspensions. Once again, we heard from grassroots leaders, particularly young grassroots leaders in communities of Fresno, in South Los Angeles, in Long Beach, in City Heights in San Diego, in the Bay Area, in Alameda, and Oakland. And they put an issue on our radar screen that we were not aware of. And that issue was that they felt the health of the community was being compromised because too many young people in schools, particularly Black and brown young people, and particularly Black and brown young men in schools and in school districts, were being expelled and suspended for behavioral issues. And if you go back and take a look at the post-Columbine shooting school incident in Colorado, and then you go back to the crack cocaine-induced criminalization phenomenon that swept the country, the 3 strikes and you're out, while all of that was happening, and our prison population exploded after crack cocaine as we decided that the only way to keep community safety as a result of the crack cocaine epidemic was to incarcerate and criminalize, that a similar phenomenon was actually happening in school settings. And if you put a chart of the incarceration rates next to a chart of school suspension and expulsion rates, the charts track each other over a 20-year period. A 400% increase in the incarcerated population in the United States during that period of time, and a 400% increase in school suspensions over the same period of time. That for some reason, criminalization and marginalization took root even in our school systems. And that when a troubled young person is acting out in a school setting, a recognition and a realization that the worst thing you can do to a young person who's acting out in school is to expel them. Now, I'm not saying expulsion is never an option, but suspensions and expulsions became a substantial option for schools and classrooms across the country, not just in California, but across the country. And these young people that we were supporting were saying, never going back, that we need to get young people the supports they need. We need more mental health and behavioral health services and supports and counseling in school settings. And we need to leave suspensions and expulsions as the last option rather than the first option when a young person acts out in school. We supported their campaign. They mobilized. They got their voices heard. I am happy to report to you that since that campaign several years ago, school suspension rates in the state of California are down by more than 50%, as school districts have realized that they need to do a better job of getting young people the kind of supports they need in the school setting and in community partnerships, and not just expelling and suspending kids out of school, because that's when they first become criminalized. And that's when the school to prison pipeline really opens up the moment you start suspending and expelling young people out of the school setting. That's when you send a message to that young person, you're not needed, you're not wanted, we don't want you, and maybe prison is a better place for you than in school. So that's been our experience over the last 10 years with building healthy communities and at the California Endowment, investing in people who have a reimagined view of the future. And Homeboy Industries has been an inspiring partner for us on that front and continues to be. Right now, I can tell you that at the California Endowment, we're investing in yet another reimagined view of our future here in Los Angeles in our community. Homeboy Industries in their work, letting the County Board of Supervisors and state governments and governors and other elected officials know that there are other ways to get to public safety, that the community needs to be centered in those policies and system changes, and that we can never give up on the hope and vision and aspirations that communities leaders and grassroots leaders have about a future for their young people. And so right now we're working to support a Homeboy-inspired vision of what we're calling here in the backyard of our property here at the California Endowment. We have Homeboy Industries sort of at one end of this swath of properties, and I'm about to refer to it in a second. And then the men's central jail is at the other end. So right in our backyard, right across the street from our property, we have Homeboy Industries as a partner with their campus. And they're looking to expand their campus for greater housing and community-based supports. But we're also in a conversation with many advocates and impacted people that have been incarcerated, in a conversation with the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors about not rebuilding the dilapidated men's central jail. Getting those folks, and more than 50% of them with diagnosed mental health issues, getting them into community-based services that they need. Closing the men's central jail and replacing the property of the men's central jail, which is not too far from Homeboy Industries, just a couple of blocks away, and turning those properties into a restorative village of housing, supportive housing, job training, community-based supports. How can we reimagine what a jail looks like, tear it down, and replace a dilapidated jail with a restorative village that is an indication of the future of what our justice system can be and what our justice system can look like. And so Father Greg and the board at Homeboy Industries working with others and us, and we'll be in support of that vision. But that's yet another example of not only never going back, but where are we going to? Where are we headed to? And that's an example of Martin Luther King's beloved community vision for this nation many years ago. A spirit and ethos of inclusion, of belonging, of compassion, of what Father Greg Boyle, one of his favorite words, kinship, in practice, in policies, in structures, informing and shaping how dollars are spent and how systems mobilize. And we have another, in closing, I'll say we have another great opportunity before us that we just possibly cannot waste. Right now, we have more federal money being spent as a result of COVID in terms of stimulus and infrastructure. We have the ARP, or the American Rescue Plan dollars, and many of those dollars are continuing to find their way into communities. There is another proposal that the Biden administration has called the Recovery Plan, which, with any luck, another more than $1 trillion or so going into communities around the country, matching or exceeding the infrastructure bill that is making its way through Congress now, and hopefully that gets through. So we have the potential for more than $1 trillion heading into communities for infrastructure, for jobs, for housing, for hope. And the question is whether those dollars can be deployed and allocated with the experiences and wisdom of the most impacted communities in mind. and not just the usual top-down way of getting money out in business as usual. And so the challenge, I think, to us in social justice philanthropy and to you at Homeboy Industries and all of us who care about the beloved community and transformational and structural changes, we're going to have to be vigilant and engaged in how this unprecedented level of federal spending, as much money as the Great Society under Lyndon Baines Johnson, and perhaps as much as the New Deal in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's time in the 1930s after the Depression. This is a once in a 50-year opportunity to see that these federal resources are allocated in a way that is informed and shaped by racial injustice and the experiences of impacted communities, and never going back to a system of structurally mediated and manufactured hopelessness in this country. And so we believe in agency, we believe in belonging, we believe that leads to change. We'll continue to invest in organizations like Homeboy Industries, like the Youth Justice Coalition that I mentioned, like the Dreamers, who have a very different view of what America can be and what this nation can be and what California must be. And so keep pushing, Homeboy family, not just services, which you provide in excellent ways to those that are impacted by injustice and criminalization and marginalization, but in the structural and system and policy changes that must occur so that we manufacture hope instead of hopelessness. And I'll close with a great line from one of my favorite movies. And it was Shawshank Redemption. And in one of the closing scenes of the Shawshank Redemption, which is a movie about two very close friends imprisoned in New England. One happened to be African-American, played by Morgan Freeman, and one happened to be white. And they were talking about, they were discussing their hopes for life outside prison bars. And one of the closing great lines there is from one of the inmates to his friend, who's the other inmate, to Morgan Freeman. And he says, you know, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things. And it's a good thing that should never die. And so I know, Father Greg, you have been, and Homeboy Industries and the Homeboy Industries family, no better narrator than the message of hope and kinship than Homeboy Industries. And we need to continue to hang our investment hat and our investment hopes on that issue of that good thing which must never die, and that is hope. And so I say thank you to all of the Homeboy family, wherever you are. Keep that vision alive, stay vigilant, stay active, keep your voice powerful and resonant and strong, and center the experiences of the most impacted and adversely impacted by this pandemic, by injustice, in all of what we do. Thank you. And I'm not sure whether we'll have an opportunity for questions or not. I'll leave that to the facilitator and the moderator, Allison. I'm available if.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions in the chat, we have another 20 minutes of the session. We could probably take 2, and I'll look at the chat and then just ask them. I did actually grab a couple, Dr. Ross, and I was going to send them directly to Heina. One person was sort of asking, how do they search for an organization like the Endowment in their area that would be working on projects like the Healthy Communities Initiative that you talked about, and that would have multi-year commitments to organizations like they did to Boyle Heights and that neighborhood, I guess, in particular? Where do they go for those resources to find partners?
Yeah, it depends on the state that they're in, and that would be helpful to me. And maybe you've got my email, Allison. Maybe you can connect me to that person by email, because it depends on the state. I can better answer that question, given my knowledge of philanthropic organizations And I will say national organizations or national foundations that are invested in this work. The Ford Foundation is one, the Kellogg Foundation is another, the Open Society Foundation is another. The Kresge Foundation does a lot of community development and investment kind of work. The Balmer Group here in Los Angeles supports not only Homeboy, but does work in Michigan, and I believe maybe in Seattle as well. So yeah, but those are the national foundations who invest in social justice oriented organizations as we do. But in order to give you a really good answer, we need to know what state you're dialing in from, and I can perhaps give you a lead or two based on geographically where you're at.
Perfect. That's really helpful. And then one other person just asked a really specific question that as they're getting ready to launch an organization and work with youth, what would be the most important things to think about in keeping them safe? What are the programs or services to sort of hold them to keep them safe? Really specific, but a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably not as specific an answer as you would want, and maybe you know this already. So if you know this already, then I'm just affirming it. I would say the thing we've learned the most and the best as a private foundation, and we do evaluate and research on programs that we fund. So this is not just Bob's opinion. A lot of it is research and data driven. But, you know, the great civil rights attorney, Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative in the South and in Alabama and has defended death row inmates for many years. In his writings and in his speeches, he talks about the importance of being proximate. And what he means by that is the closer you are to the pain of injustice that is experienced, the smarter you'll be as a partner and supporter, in our case, an investor, right? And so the analogy there for us as a foundation is we used to rely more on the wisdom of research and policy institutes and organizations. We probably did more funding of research institutes at Rand and Harvard and others around healthcare and criminal justice in schools. We now center, in terms of wisdom and strategy, we now center directly the experiences of those most impacted. So right now, our investment strategy around criminal justice is driven by the experiences of impacted persons. Same in school health. And so the more you can turn your ear to the experiences of those young people and get their views and opinion on what would make a difference in their lives in terms of strategy, it takes more time. But if you've got the patience to be a great listener, I call it leadership by listening. The closer you can be to the experiences of those young people, let them be the ones that are the strategic architects of how you provide services, and don't necessarily revert back to traditional avenues of service delivery. And so that's my best wisdom is to ask the young people themselves what would improve safety in their community. And you may be affirmed by what you hear, or you may hear some things that you were never prepared to hear, but you should take them seriously.
So there's one question too about this idea of how do we inch ourselves closer and reach out to those people who would tend to so often dismiss the idea of structural racism and class inequality and really look towards it that's something that doesn't exist? How do we engage with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, and I understand the root of it. I would say I put the civic landscape and political landscape in kind of three categories, Allison. Category number one is the people who made up their minds and are not going to listen to anything. And it's not that they shouldn't be engaged, but you can get an idea. There are people right now. There are people who, the current example is the COVID pandemic, and now COVID is becoming a disease, increasingly a disease of people who refuse to be vaccinated. Now, some of those people who refuse to be vaccinated can be educated to be vaccinated with more information, with more science and data. And there are other people who are just never going to be vaccinated for their own political or ideological views. And so that becomes a very tough audience to deal with. But if you can deal with the other two audiences, those that can be persuaded, and sometimes the persuasion, as we've learned in our policy work, no numbers without stories, and no stories without numbers. And the numbers refer to research and the data. And for example, to this day, there's never been a study produced that juvenile incarceration helps anybody. We've invested in an entire system of juvenile incarceration in this country on no data or no research that it actually works. Okay. And so, but there's data to the opposite, that incarcerating people actually harms them, right? And so there's the science, and then the stories are impacted persons themselves that have been in the system and providing their alternative view and their alternative systems and their alternative reimagined structures for how to make communities safe and keep communities safe and to help people get cured of their abject hopelessness. And so I think that we need to get better at combining the numbers and stories. And so I've seen it work certainly here in Los Angeles and California, where with the help of Homeboy Industries, and I will say to this, I'll close on this example. What's very interesting is when we have a community hearing at the Board of Supervisors here at Los Angeles County, and there's an issue, a policy issue on the table for the board. Maybe occasionally you'll see Father Greg show up, but what Homeboy Industries will do is send someone who's been in the system and impacted by the system to testify, to tell their story, right? And that is the most powerful path to hope, is for someone who's been through the course of hopelessness and marginalization and racism and can tell their story themselves of redemption and restoration and a path from hopelessness to wellness. And so we find that those are the best ways to move people that are capable of being moved in the political and civic landscape.
Dr. Ross, I am so grateful to you for your partnership with Homeboy and for leading us in this graceful way, and just for being available today for this global community. Your words are so impactful, and in the chat is be prepared for some folks to want to connect with you via email, and we'll send that information to Heina, your assistant, and please thank her too. We're so grateful for you. Thank you, Dr. Ross.
Much love to the entire Homeboy family. Just love who you are and what you do and why you do it. Thank you.
Thank you.